Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. Virgil Bowens never imagined that his quiet, sun-drenched farm, his family's legacy for 5 generations, would become a battlefield. But when Karen Waterford, the relentless HOA president, arrived with her clipboard and grand plans to turn his land into a recreation center, Virgil knew this fight would define his life. Virgil Bowens had always known that the land he called home was no ordinary stretch of dirt and grass. His 50-acre farm, nestled in the shadow of Arizona's Red Mountains, was a legacy, one passed down through 5 generations of Bowens. To Virgil, every weathered fence post, every row of thriving grapevines, and even the old oak tree by the pond told a story. This land wasn't just a place, it was a living monument to his family's resilience and love for the soil. For Virgil, the farm was where he'd spent endless sun-drenched afternoons as a boy, driving an ancient tractor alongside his father. It was where his grandfather had taught him the secret to nurturing vines, and where his late mother's laugh still seemed to echo on the breeze. The farm wasn't just a business or a home, it was part of him, and Virgil made it his life's mission to preserve what his family had built. But the world around him had begun to change. Over the past 2 decades, the neighboring farms had started to disappear, sold off to developers who saw untapped potential in the land. In place of sprawling fields and rustic barns, now stood rows of identical houses, their manicured lawns and neat driveways a sharp contrast to the rugged beauty of Virgil's land. These subdivisions came with their own sets of rules, enforced by homeowners associations, HOAs that seemed determined to regulate everything from fence colors to mailbox designs. Virgil had watched as these HOAs expanded their influence, creeping closer to his farm with each passing year. His neighbors, once fellow farmers, had dwindled in number. Some retired, while others couldn't resist the financial allure of selling their land for development. Still, Virgil held firm. As he often reminded himself, this land is ours. No one's taking it. That resolve would soon be tested. It started on an uncharacteristically quiet afternoon in June. Virgil had just finished repairing the irrigation pump near his vineyard when he noticed a sleek, bright red SUV pull into his gravel driveway. From it stepped a woman in a tailored yellow suit and high heels, an outfit as out of place as a cactus in a snowstorm. Clipboard in hand, she walked toward him with a brisk, almost rehearsed confidence. "Good afternoon. You must be Mr. Bowens," she said, flashing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm Karen Waterford, president of the Green Canyons HOA." Virgil set down his wrench and wiped his hands on his jeans, his expression unreadable. He'd heard about Karen from the neighbors, though he'd never met her before. She was known for her relentless ambition and for running the HOA like her personal empire. "Afternoon," Virgil replied curtly, sensing this wasn't just a social visit. Karen wasted no time. Launching into a polished pitch, she explained the HOA's plans to enhance the community with a new amenity, a sprawling recreation center, complete with an open-air pool, picnic zones, saunas, and a cafe. It would be a hub of togetherness for Green Canyon's residents. And as fate would have it, Virgil's land was the perfect location for such a project. "We'd like to make you an offer for about 10 acres on the western side of your property," she said, flipping through her clipboard and producing what appeared to be a contract. "Of course, we're prepared to compensate you generously. It's a win-win. You benefit financially, and the community gains an invaluable resource." Virgil studied her for a moment, weighing his words carefully. "No," he said simply. Karen blinked, clearly unprepared for such a blunt response. "I don't think you understand, Mr. Bowens. This would increase property values for everyone in the area, including you. Surely you can see the benefit." "I said no." Virgil interrupted, his voice calm but firm. "This land's not for sale." Karen's smile faltered, but only briefly. "Well, I hope you'll reconsider," she said, her tone suddenly cooler. "Progress doesn't wait for anyone, Mr. Bowens. We'll be in touch." Virgil watched as she turned on her heel and clicked her way back to her car. The red SUV kicked up dust as it sped down the driveway, leaving him alone with his thoughts. He knew deep down that this wasn't the last he'd see of Karen Waterford. And he was right. The visit was only the beginning of what would become the fight of Virgil's life. Karen Waterford's visit was only the opening act in what quickly spiraled into a full-scale battle for Virgil Bowens' land. A few days after her departure, Virgil began noticing subtle but telling changes. Letters from the Green Canyons HOA arrived in his mailbox almost daily, each one stamped with Karen's signature and filled with increasingly insistent language. The letters outlined how the recreation center would revitalize the neighborhood and claimed his property was an essential piece of the project. At first, Virgil simply tossed them into the trash, but Karen's persistence didn't stop at letters. Soon, rumors began circulating among his neighbors. When Virgil visited the local feed store, he overheard snippets of conversation that made his stomach churn. "I heard Virgil's holding up the whole project," one neighbor muttered to another near the seed racks. "They're saying he's being unreasonable. Who wouldn't want to make some extra money?" Virgil clenched his jaw and left the store without saying a word. He realized Karen had already begun framing him as the villain, a stubborn obstacle to progress. Her strategy was clear: isolate him and turn the community against him. A week later, the tension escalated further. Virgil returned home one evening to find a small group of neighbors gathered near his property line, talking animatedly. When he approached, a man named Roger, one of the newer residents and an enthusiastic supporter of Karen, stepped forward. "Virgil," Roger began, trying to sound diplomatic, "we're all reasonable people here. Why don't you come to the next HOA meeting and talk this out? Karen says there's room for negotiation." "Negotiation about what?" Virgil replied, his voice low. "I told her my land's not for sale. End of story." Roger's smile tightened. "You're missing the bigger picture. This project could bring so much value to everyone here. Don't you want to be part of the community's growth?" Virgil fixed him with a hard stare. "I've been part of this community longer than you've lived here, Roger, and I've got no interest in selling out what my family built for a pool and a cafe." The group murmured among themselves as Virgil walked away, feeling the weight of their judgment. Then came the legal threats. One morning, Virgil opened a certified letter from the HOA, its language markedly more aggressive. The letter claimed his western field, the one Karen wanted, was subject to new zoning regulations. According to the HOA, a portion of his land now fell under their jurisdiction, granting them certain rights to develop it. Virgil immediately called his lawyer, Daniel Rhodes, a family friend who had helped him with land disputes in the past. "They can't just redraw property lines and take your land," Daniel reassured him after reviewing the documents. "This looks like a bluff, but keep an eye out. People like Karen don't back down easily." Despite Daniel's confidence, Virgil couldn't shake the feeling that Karen was playing a long game. His suspicions deepened when he noticed unfamiliar cars slowly driving past his property. Once, he even saw Karen herself, standing just outside the property line with her ever-present clipboard, jotting notes and talking on her phone. "She's watching, waiting for something," Virgil muttered to himself. The turning point came on a scorching Saturday afternoon. Virgil was returning from a delivery to a local market when he noticed a new sign erected just beyond his property line. In bold letters, it read, "Future home of the Green Canyons Community Recreation Center." He slammed on the brakes, his truck skidding to a stop in the gravel. Jumping out, he stormed over to the sign, his blood boiling. It wasn't just the sign that enraged him, it was the audacity. Beyond the sign, stakes had been driven into the ground, marking out what looked like the boundaries of the proposed development. Virgil immediately called Karen. "Care to explain why there's a sign for your project on my land?" he demanded as soon as she picked up. "Oh, Virgil, I'm glad you noticed," she replied, her tone syrupy sweet. "We thought it might help you visualize what this space could become. Isn't it exciting?" "You've got no right to put anything on my land," Virgil snapped. "Take it down now." Karen's voice cooled. "I'd suggest you speak with your attorney, Virgil. The HOA has done everything by the book." Virgil hung up, his hands shaking with anger. That night, he barely slept. The stakes had been raised, and Karen wasn't playing fair. The next morning, things escalated yet again. While inspecting his property, Virgil discovered fresh survey markers driven into the western field. It was clear the HOA had sent surveyors to map out the area without his permission. This wasn't just pressure. This was a direct assault on his rights as a landowner. Virgil called the sheriff's office to report the unauthorized surveying. But when the deputy arrived, he explained there was little they could do without catching the surveyors in the act. "It's a civil matter," the deputy said apologetically. "You'll need to handle this in court." The realization hit Virgil like a punch to the gut. Karen wasn't just trying to bully him. She was building a legal case to force his hand. If he didn't act soon, he might lose more than just his western field. Determined not to let Karen win, Virgil made a decision. He would fight her every step of the way, but even he didn't yet realize how far Karen was willing to go to claim his land. Virgil Bowens didn't have to wait long for Karen's next move. A week after the unauthorized surveying, while tending to the eastern edge of his vineyard, he heard the low hum of heavy machinery in the distance. At first, he thought it was road work, but as the noise grew louder and closer, a sinking feeling settled in his gut. Dropping his tools, he jumped into his truck and drove toward the source. As he crested the hill overlooking the western field, his worst fears were realized. Bulldozers and excavators were tearing into the land, flattening the soil that had taken years of care to cultivate. Trucks unloaded pallets of concrete blocks, and workers in hard hats shouted instructions. The scene was chaos, but at the center of it all stood Karen Waterford, clipboard in hand, directing the operation like the queen of a hive. Virgil slammed on the brakes, sending up a cloud of dust as he skidded to a stop. He leapt out of the truck, his boots crunching on the gravel as he stormed toward Karen. "What in God's name do you think you're doing?" he bellowed, his voice echoing across the field. Karen turned with a calculated calmness, her face an unreadable mask. "Ah, Mr. Bowens," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "We're just getting started on the recreation center. Isn't it exciting to see progress in action?" "This is my land," Virgil snapped, pointing an accusatory finger at her. "You have no right to be here, no right to touch anything." Karen raised her clipboard, tapping it smugly. "Actually, according to the Green Canyons HOA zoning committee, this section is now part of the community's jurisdiction. We've already filed the necessary paperwork. You should have read the letters I sent you." Virgil's fists clenched at his sides, his knuckles white. "You don't have any authority here. This is private property, and I didn't authorize a damn thing. Pack up your machines and get out." The workers nearby hesitated, looking at each other uneasily. One of them, a burly man in a reflective vest, approached Karen and whispered something. She waved him off with an irritated gesture. "Keep working," she said curtly, then turned back to Virgil. "Mr. Bowens, I understand this is upsetting for you, but you need to accept reality. The HOA is acting within its rights." Virgil took a step closer, his voice low and steady. "You don't have rights here, Karen. What you have is a mess of lies and forged claims. And I'm calling the sheriff right now." Karen's confident demeanor faltered for a moment, but she quickly recovered. "Go ahead," she said, her tone icy. "But you're only delaying the inevitable." Virgil pulled out his phone and dialed. Within 30 minutes, a deputy arrived on the scene. The officer, a tall man with a no-nonsense air, listened as Virgil explained the situation. Karen presented her clipboard of documentation, but the deputy wasn't buying it. "Ma'am," the officer said firmly, "you can't conduct any construction on private property without the owner's explicit permission. Until this is sorted out in court, you and your crew need to leave." Karen's lips tightened into a thin line. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "The HOA has every right." The deputy raised a hand, cutting her off. "If you don't leave voluntarily, I'll have no choice but to charge you and your crew with trespassing." Grumbling under her breath, Karen waved at the workers to shut down the equipment. The machines fell silent, leaving a jarring stillness over the scarred landscape. As the crew began packing up, Virgil surveyed the damage. The field was a ruin. The fertile soil had been compacted under the weight of the machinery, and the survey stakes had been replaced with deep gouges in the earth. The years of careful tending to the land were undone in mere hours. Karen shot Virgil a venomous glare as she climbed into her SUV. "This isn't over, Mr. Bowens," she hissed before slamming the door and driving off. Virgil stood motionless, staring after her. He knew she wasn't bluffing. This wasn't just a confrontation. It was the opening salvo of a war. As the dust settled, he resolved to strike back, harder than she ever expected. Karen had declared battle on his land, his family's legacy, and everything he held dear. And he wasn't about to lose. The battle between Virgil Bowens and Karen Waterford was far from over, but the first victory had been claimed. With the sheriff shutting down construction and the crew forced to leave his property, Virgil knew he had bought himself some breathing room. Yet as he stood in the torn soil of his western field, the silence felt heavy. The damage Karen had inflicted was more than physical, it was personal. That evening, Virgil sat with his lawyer, Daniel Rhodes, reviewing the situation. Daniel laid out the next steps with the precision of a seasoned attorney. "We've got a strong case," Daniel said, flipping through the documents Karen had submitted to justify the construction. "This zoning claim she's throwing around, it doesn't hold water. We'll file an injunction first thing tomorrow morning to block any further activity on your land." "Good," Virgil muttered, staring out of the window. "But I want more than just an injunction. I want her held accountable for what she's done." "You'll get your chance," Daniel assured him. Between the trespassing, property damage, and fraudulent claims, Karen and the HOA are in hot water. But be prepared, they're not going to back down quietly. Virgil nodded. He wasn't expecting Karen to give up, not after the length she'd already gone to. The court process moved swiftly. Within days, the injunction was granted, effectively halting any further attempts by the HOA to encroach on Virgil's land. But Karen wasn't going to let it end there. She countered with her own legal filings, insisting that the HOA had every right to develop the land and accusing Virgil of being uncooperative with community progress. The courtroom became the next battleground. Both sides presented their cases, but the scales quickly tipped in Virgil's favor. Daniel's meticulous preparation revealed Karen's tactics in brutal detail. Witnesses from the construction crew testified that Karen had instructed them to begin work, despite knowing the land was privately owned. Property records surveyed and notarized decades earlier left no doubt that Virgil's western field was indisputably his. But the damning blow came when an HOA board member, under pressure from cross-examination, admitted that Karen had acted unilaterally. She hadn't consulted the board before initiating construction and had exaggerated the HOA's authority in an attempt to pressure Virgil. Karen's confidence crumbled as the evidence mounted. The judge ruled decisively in Virgil's favor, citing gross misconduct on Karen's part. The consequences for Karen and the HOA were swift and severe. Karen was fined for trespassing and property damage, with additional penalties for her fraudulent claims. The court ordered the HOA to pay damages to Virgil, covering the cost of repairing his land and compensating for the crops he had lost during the disruption. For Karen, the fallout went beyond legal penalties. Her reputation, once the foundation of her authority within the HOA, was in shambles. The Green Canyon's HOA board held an emergency meeting to address the scandal, and by the end of the week, Karen had been removed from her position as president. But Virgil wasn't focused on Karen's downfall. His attention was on the restoration of his farm. The compensation awarded by the court was enough to start repairing the western field, but the work was daunting. The compacted soil needed to be revitalized, and replanting would take years before it could yield the kind of harvest he'd once relied on. What surprised Virgil most, however, was the support he received from his neighbors. Many of the same people who had hesitated to take his side earlier now rallied around him. They showed up with shovels and tractors, helping to break apart the concrete slabs left behind by Karen's failed project. Some donated seedlings and equipment, while others simply offered words of encouragement. One day, Roger, who had once pressured Virgil to sell, came to the farm with a case of iced tea and an apology. "You were right to stand your ground," Roger admitted, looking genuinely contrite. "We should have supported you from the start. Let me know if there's anything I can do to help." Virgil accepted the apology with a nod, though he couldn't resist adding, "Just don't let anyone like Karen sweet-talk you into this nonsense again." As the days turned into weeks, the scars on the land began to heal. The fields would never be the same, but Virgil took solace in the fact that they were his. For the first time in months, he felt a sense of peace. The storm had passed, and his farm had survived. But more importantly, he had proven that no one, not even someone as relentless as Karen Waterford, could take away what generations of Bowens had worked so hard to preserve. With the legal battle behind him, Virgil Bowens began to feel the weight of months of tension and conflict lifting from his shoulders. Although the scars on his land were still fresh, the victory was a turning point, not just for him, but for the entire community. As word of the court ruling spread, the local narrative shifted. Virgil, once framed as the stubborn holdout resisting progress, was now seen as a protector of the area's legacy. His fight against Karen Waterford became a rallying point for neighbors who had silently endured the HOA's overreach. Neighbors who had once hesitated to support him now spoke with admiration. Families who'd sold their land and felt powerless against the HOA shared stories of how they'd been pressured or misled. Even those who had initially supported Karen's vision for the recreation center began to question the HOA's practices. The most significant change was within the HOA itself. Karen's removal as president marked the beginning of a much-needed reckoning. A group of reform-minded residents took charge of the board and vowed to restore balance. They repealed several overreaching policies, limited the board's authority, and instituted measures to ensure transparency. For the first time, HOA meetings focused on collaboration rather than control, giving residents a voice in decisions. For Virgil, the aftermath brought more than just justice. It brought unexpected solidarity. Neighbors who had once kept their distance now came to his aid. One Saturday morning, a caravan of tractors and pickup trucks arrived at his farm. People climbed out with tools, shovels, and bags of seeds, ready to help restore what had been lost. "It's the least we can do," said one neighbor, handing Virgil a bag of apple saplings. "You stood up for all of us." The community worked side by side, breaking apart the concrete slabs, tilling the compacted soil, and planting new rows of crops. Children ran through the fields, chasing each other while their parents helped rebuild. What had once felt like an isolating battle now brought people together in a way Virgil hadn't seen in years. Virgil's farm slowly began to heal. The western field, though damaged, showed signs of life as new shoots emerged from the soil. His vineyard, once thought lost, was replanted with young vines that promised a future harvest. More importantly, Virgil saw a renewed sense of connection among his neighbors. The experience reminded everyone of the value of standing up for what was right and supporting each other in times of need. Months later, Virgil hosted a small barbecue on his property to thank those who had helped him rebuild. Standing on his porch, overlooking the crowd of familiar faces laughing and sharing stories, he realized his victory wasn't just about saving his land. It was about restoring the spirit of a community that had forgotten its strength. "Turns out Karen did one good thing after all," Virgil said to Daniel Rhodes with a wry smile. "She brought us all back together." The fight had been difficult, but the rewards were clear. A stronger, more united neighborhood, a reformed HOA, and a renewed determination to protect what truly mattered. As the months passed, Virgil Bowens found himself reflecting on the fight he never asked for, but ultimately couldn't avoid. Sitting on the porch of his farmhouse, the warm evening breeze carried the faint scent of freshly tilled soil. His gaze swept over the recovering western field, where young crops were beginning to sprout. Though the scars of Karen Waterford's invasion were still visible, life was returning to the land, just as it always had after every challenge his family faced over the generations. The victory wasn't just about reclaiming his property. It was about proving that standing firm in the face of injustice could inspire change. The farm had survived floods, droughts, and market crashes, but this conflict had been different. It wasn't nature he'd fought. It was people blinded by power and greed. Yet in the end, justice had prevailed. What surprised Virgil most was the transformation in his neighbors. The sense of unity that emerged after Karen's defeat felt like a rediscovery of the community's true essence. People who once seemed content to remain silent now felt emboldened to challenge authority when it overstepped. The Green Canyons HOA, once a tool of control, had become a more transparent, community-focused organization. Karen Waterford had vanished from public life, her name a cautionary tale whispered during HOA meetings. The damage she caused served as a reminder of what unchecked ambition could lead to, but her fall also catalyzed positive change. For Virgil, the struggle cemented his place not only as a guardian of his family's legacy, but as a figure of quiet resilience in his community. The land wasn't just soil and crops, it was a story that carried the weight of his ancestors' sacrifices and his own determination. As the sun dipped behind the mountains, casting golden light over the farm, Virgil smiled. His fight wasn't just for himself, but for the values that defined the land and the people who lived near it. No matter what challenges lay ahead, he knew one thing for certain: the Bowens farm would endure, and so would he.